My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. And I have a strong feeling that you and I are going to become friends because there's so much work that you've done that I find fascinating, and I'm going to keep inviting you back for more.
Great. I need friends. I have a lot of enemies.
Join the club. All right. So you've written extensively on kind of the history of Christianity and how it links to the West and how it links to the Roman Empire. And I'm trying to think of a place to start. And I think perhaps a foundational place actually is, what is the Torah?
Yeah, well, that's a good place to start, because obviously Christianity is coming from the the Abrahamic tradition. So let's call it the Jewish tradition, even though we could prefer to call it the Hebraic tradition or whatever. But the Torah. If we start with the Torah, I would say the best definition for me of the Torah would be to say it's a book written by the Jews, claiming that God chose the Jews. I mean, that's the leitmotif of the Torah. God, the creator of the universe, chose one people. They might not have been called the Jews originally. The Jew originally in the Greek means Judean, people of Judea, or people of the tribe of Judea. So the tribe of Judea was only one of the 12 tribes, but Israel. Anyway, maybe we will not get too much into the history of Israel because everybody knows it. And anyway, I have no special, nothing to contradict to the mainstream history of Israel. So, but if you look at it from the outside, if you look at the Torah from outside of the Christian tradition, of course, if you look at it from inside the Christian tradition, then you have a different outlook, because you basically believe it's basically true that God chose one people. But if you step out of, which is the position I take, I clearly state I'm not a Christian. I'm not talking from within the Christian tradition. I have no problem with Jesus. I have no problem with the story of Christ itself. But Christianity is a completely different subject. So I'm talking from outside. I don't believe that God chose the Jews. So for me, it's a book that says, that pretends, that claims God chose the Jews. And then it's a history. The Torah is the law that God gave the Jews, and the history of the relationship between God and His people, and the relationship between Israel and the other nations. Yeah, that's the Torah. So we could talk about when was it written. There's a lot of debate about that. I more agree with recent scholarship that tend to say that the Torah as we have it today is much less old than we used to think, even though some parts of it may be very old, but the editorial process and the ideology that is consistent from one book to the other dates from the Hellenistic period. Most scholars, I think, today would agree with the fact that it dates either from the very beginning of the Hellenistic period, or the Persian period, or the Babylonian period. Most people would not say it dates before the Babylonian exile. So some people would say it was basically crafted by Esdras, who was kind of leading the priest, the sacerdotal caste in Babylonian in the 5th century BC. That was a theory already of Baruch Spinoza. But most people now tend to think that the way we have it is actually much less, is much younger. It was written more in the Hellenistic period. So, it's a book that claims that God chose one people, and God gave them this land, and then God ordered them to fight their enemies to the death, and God gave them also a destiny to control the world. Basically, if you look at, there are a lot of passages in the Deuteronomy that says basically, Israel will prevail over all other nations and will rule over all other nations of the world. The world being, of course, at that time more the the Mediterranean and until Persia. That would be my basic definition of the Torah.
Do you think there's a meaningful difference between the Jewish religion and Jewish identity?
Well, that's a very difficult topic. By the way, we talked about the Torah. I was actually more talking about the Tanakh, because the Torah is the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and then the historical books, and then the prophetic books. So if we put all that together, the Jews call it the Tanakh. Sometimes they use the Torah for the Tanakh, but the Torah, to be precise, is more the 5 books of Moses. Well, Jews obviously are both a people in a sense of a nation. Nation being etymologically means a genetic, an ethnic entity, and a religion. But obviously, they're both. So sometimes they would more define themselves as a religion. Sometimes they would more define themselves as a nation, and that's a whole debate within the Jewish community. Are we more people or are we more a religion? In the 19th century or the early 19th century, at the time of Napoleon, they would claim we are a people, we are a religion, so we ask for the same rights as other religions, and that's how they got the rights to be citizens of France, because they say we're not a separate people, we're just a separate religion. But then that became the main identity of Reform Judaism. Jews claim to be just a religion, and wherever you live, you are a citizen of that. But then the Zionists reacted against that and say, no, we're not a religion, we're fundamentally a nation, and we want our land, and we want our own state, and so on. So they rejected the idea that Jews are a religion. They say, so it's always, it's always both. It depends on the viewpoint. But fundamentally, it's the same if you realize that the most fundamental commandment in the Torah is endogamy, is not mix up with other nations. So the fundamental religious commandment is to be a nation. So that's why there is no real contradiction between being a religion and because it's a religion based on the fundamental commandment not to mix up with other races, not to intermarry with other nations. Of course, they do. In history there are periods where they would intermarry with other nations and proselytize. But fundamentally, there is no contradiction between the religious identity and the ethnic identity.
The reason why I ask that is because that kind of forms the basis of what it means to be Western, or what Western society is. And you argue that the West is fundamentally Greco-Roman and not Judeo-Christian. Is that right?
Well, yeah. I came to that conclusion after studying, after studying different periods of history. But if I look, for example, at the Renaissance, if we look at our civilization today and everything we admire in our civilization, everything we are proud of, well, we would think about art, like sculptures, paintings, music. We would think about science. We would think about philosophy, science, mathematics and mechanics and all. And we would think about philosophy. Maybe we would think also about political science and so on. And all these things, if we study historically, they came from the Renaissance. They did not really exist before the Renaissance. If you take art, that's one thing that struck me one day almost. I mean, not one day, but I mean, it became very clear suddenly to me that we tend to idealize the Middle Ages before the Renaissance. But if we really look, what did the Middle Ages give us? Except a nice mythology, except a lot of literature, the King Arthur, except the narrative about the Crusades and all these ideals about chivalry, and the knights and so on. What did, we didn't get art from the Middle Ages. There was an incredible creativity in the Renaissance compared to the Middle Age. It was a tremendous advancement. Science was almost non-existent in the Middle Age. Of course, the Middle Age is 1,000 years. So if I say that, we could get into the details. And basically, what was the Renaissance? It was a rediscovery of the Greco-Roman world. Fundamentally, everybody agrees that's almost the definition of a renaissance, the rebirth of the pre-Christian tradition. And that's very true. The Renaissance people were just falling in love, rediscovering the Greeks and the Romans, mostly the Greeks, but the Romans also, Roman technology, Roman architecture, Greek philosophy, Greek science. Sometimes they rediscovered it before the Renaissance. They were already kind of rediscovering it a little bit through the Arabs. It did not happen all at once. But it happens quite suddenly in Italy, in Florence. It was really a movement that started in one city in Florence, in Italy. And that was really the birth of what we imagine today as the greatness of our civilization. If you realistically think what is the greatness of our civilization, then it really started in the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was basically a rediscovery. Of course, they added a whole lot of things, but it was a rediscovery of the Greek science. The rediscovery of Plato, rediscovery of the pre-Socratic, mathematicians and so on. We could get into the details, but that's something that, of course, can be debated. But if you accept that analysis, then of course that means our civilization is fundamentally Greco-Roman from intellectual viewpoint, artistic viewpoint, our vision of human beings, our vision, our attachment to our fundamental trust in reason. It's definitely not coming from Christianity. So Christianity, of course, is part of our civilization. I'm not saying it counts for nothing, but it doesn't count for that much, in my opinion. So if I say that, I ask people, where am I wrong here? What in our civilization would come directly from Christianity instead of coming from? And always people come to, for example, well, what about the cathedrals? They always try to search, the cathedrals, that's not Greco-Romans, that's typical Christian civilization. And I say, yes, of course, the cathedral is something very special. We love it. We love them today. Actually, we started loving them in the 19th century. Before that, during the Renaissance, they didn't like this style so much. They called it Gothic. I mean, the Renaissance, they started to call it Gothic because the Goths are the barbarians. So it was a barbarian art. But basically, let's say it's great. But who built the cathedral? Not Christian monks, not Christian bishops, not the Pope, people who had some deep knowledge of construction. And the funny thing is we call them Freemasons, The people who built the cathedrals, they were kind of funny Christians, They were not really your typical kind of Christian. They had their secret knowledge, they had their mathematics and so on, and they were an international trade. So if you think realistically, what's Christian about the cathedrals, really? It's not the technology is not coming from Christianity at all. So, it's a special kind of thing that belongs to Christendom, but it's not Christian. It has nothing to do with Christian doctrine. It has nothing to do with, Christian beliefs in the afterlife, in hell, in original sin. It has absolutely nothing to do. And then people come with all kind of other things. They come with what about Gregorian chant? I say, well, Gregorian chant is great music when you are not allowed to use instrument. You're not allowed to use polyphony. You do, but music was much more developed before Gregorian chant, and when it became liberated from church, different taboos, then it developed So classical music, of course, was non-existent in the Middle Age. The earliest classical music we have today, sometimes we call it medieval music. It's not medieval music; it's Renaissance music. We know almost nothing about music. So, yeah, that's I think a point that needs to be discussed. But for me, it was a kind of breakthrough in my vision, to feel free to criticize to analyze Christianity critically, because I feel I'm not attacking our civilization when I'm trying to find out what Christianity did to us, because in fact Christianity is not the source of the greatness of our civilization. And when I understood that, and then I kind of overcame the kind of dilemma: is it good to criticize Christianity because our civilization is built on Christianity? So if I criticize Christianity, am I not undermining our? Then I realized, no, not at all. The foundation of our civilization is not Christianity.
The term Judeo-Christian in itself is contradictory, isn't it?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, it's just a term, so it depends how you define it. In a sense, I would claim it's not that contradictory from my viewpoint. It depends how you look at it, but we could say if our civilization is, I would say our civilization is definitely not Judeo-Christian. It's fundamentally Greco-Roman. So if you want to add Christianity in there, you would say it's or Helleno-Christian, Okay, Helleno-Christian is Hellenistic. Roman civilization is basically Hellenistic. So inside Helleno, you have the Roman civilization, because Roman civilization fundamentally is the Western extension of Hellenistic civilization. Hellenistic civilization being the Hellenic civilization spread by Alexander the Great, who he died before he went west, but basically Roman civilization is Greek. So you can say it's Helleno-Christian. So yes, I would say our civilization cannot be defined as Judeo-Christian. On the other hand, to me, as I study and as I analyze Christianity, I realize it's much more Jewish than we think. Christianity is very Jewish. That's my analysis, looking at different aspects. So I would say Christianity is Judeo-Christian, fundamentally. And one fundamental way our civilization is somehow still Judeo-Christian is that the Christianization from the time of Constantine the Great and his sons, and then the Theodosian dynasty and so on, finally declared that there's only two religions which are allowed, not one, there are two. All non-Christian religion were banned. It took basically 1 century. Constantine did not ban them, but he favored Christianity. He deplatformed, we would say, definanced pagan cult and so on. But in the end, there was only two religions allowed: Christianity and Judaism. Judaism was never forbidden, never banned. It was protected. It had a lot of privilege. The people don't know and don't think like this, but in fact, that's a reality that people who have studied this period called late antiquity. The period of Christianization is what we call late antiquity. Like Ramsay MacMillan, like Peter Heather. I've read all the books. I spent, a year reading all the books I could. It's fascinating. Late antiquity is fascinating because it's kind of a period that became a subject of deep interest only in the 1950s, 1960s. So it's kind of almost a new, not so many people were focusing on that period. It was supposed to be a little bit dark but finally, people who studied that period agree that fundamentally Judaism received a lot of privilege at that period. I mean, compared to pagans. Of course, pagans were persecuted and their temples were destroyed, but Jews were preserved under the justification. The fundamental justification was provided by St. Augustine, and then it was always repeated. Of course, a lot of there were a lot of trouble, a lot of pogroms, a lot of movements where the population kind of, went against the Jews. But that happened already before Christianity. There was nothing new, There were always anti-Semitism long before Christianity. So Christianity did not create the hostility of the people. But the church hierarchy and the royal power basically protected the Jews and used them, and even gave them the privilege of being the only population allowed to lend money, for example. If you look at it this way, Christians were not allowed to do it, but Jews were allowed to do it. That gave them an incredible privilege. They became the money lenders to the king and so on. They had a lot of privilege, and that started in late antiquity, and that continued even under Charlemagne. Books about Charlemagne's period, and especially Charlemagne's son, insist on the fact that Jews were very, very privileged at that time as long-distance merchants who had monopoly on many different, trades, even the slave trades. They were the best at slave trades at that time. So from that point of view, if you step outside of Christianity and you look at the development of Christendom, you can see there are only two religions there: Christianity and Judaism. And of course, they are competing with each other. They are hostile to each other. But the church declared the Jews have to be protected because they are the witness people, We should keep the Jews, we should allow the Jew to persevere as a people, and we should not force them to be. We should not compel them to be baptized. So in fact, from let's say the one of the latest article I wrote was on Kevin MacDonald's website. And it's called Christianity as a Jewish Group Evolutionary Strategy. So from the point of view of a group evolutionary strategy in the tradition of Kevin MacDonald, Christianity was excellent for the Jews. And on the other hand, pretty bad for the Goyim, for the Gentiles, for different reasons, for other reasons.
You mentioned pagan earlier, and you also speak about Hellenistic or Hellenes. What is the difference?
Oh, well, pagans is a word that basically, there's debate on where it comes from, but basically it means country people. Pagan is, in French, it's almost the same word, païen and paysan, So country people, peasants, basically. So there's debate. Does it mean peasant or just country people as opposed to people of the city, or as opposed to people coming from, Roman soldiers, coming to the country, and then local people. But basically it came up as a derogatory term, to criticize people who just can't adapt to Christianity and continue to do their ancient rituals in the countryside. Because, of course, the countryside was Christianized much later. It all started in the cities, started in the big cities. Christianity spread through the big cities in the eastern, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and so on. So country people were the last to be converted, so they were called pagans. So it was no pagan ever called himself a pagan, in fact, except today. Neo-pagans call them, but no. But in the East it was different, because the East had always preserved, even during the Christianization, they never really rejected the Greek philosophy. And in the Greek there was well, even in Rome, actually, the elite, the city elite who resisted against Christianity, called themselves Hellenes, like Hellenic, because they were attached to the Hellenic tradition. They had to find a term to define themselves, because before Christianity, they didn't need a term to define themselves. There were all kinds of religion. They didn't have one religion. They had freedom of religion. So the struggle between Christianity and pagans was not a struggle between one religion against another. It was the struggle of one religion against all others. except Judaism, as I said. And all other religions were all kinds of things. But finally, in the East, they like to call themselves Hellenes because they were attached to the higher religion. And the higher religion, of course, in the pagan world was philosophy. So that's another thing that should be clarified, because when we look at pagan religions, we have generally a vision of the popular cults, the city cults, the temples, but we forget that basically the metaphysical thinking, the questions about God, the questions about life after death, questions about the good life, good and evil, that belonged to philosophy, not to the pagan cults. So we tend to forget, that the religion, what we today call religion, we should include philosophy inside it. But because theology kind of took over philosophy, so we are a bit confused about what philosophy is. But all what we think about, or even what we think today of a religious man, a man who is very religious, who thinks about God, who thinks about doing good, in the ancient world, such a man would be called a philosopher. He might be pious, go to the temple, make offerings, or not, but he was religious in the sense of being thinking about God, thinking about living a good life, thinking about life after death, and thinking about the universe and so on.
How's this related to, quote unquote, the Roman religion, which has been written out of our cultural memory?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult topic. Pagan religion, or religions in general in the Roman world before Christianity, is a very complex thing. First of all, we need to realize that the religions of Rome, the city of Rome, was something very special. But then when Rome extended into an empire, there were many other religions that came into the Roman world. And the Romans were basically very, very welcoming to religions. Even the Romans from Rome, the city, they would easily accept a new temple to a new god. And they were always also interested in other religions. That's why all kinds of new religions came to Rome, like the religions of Isis from Egypt, religions of Mitra, and many others. So there were many, many different religions. Some people from that time distinguished three different, if we want to simplify it, to get a basic idea of what was going on. We can distinguish the cults, the rituals, so religion from that point of view was part of the social life, even the political life. If you were a citizen of one city, you had to go to the festivals of that city, the gods of that city, the temple, make some offering, contribute to participate to the city life. The city life was centered around the different, there were all kinds of holidays, much more than today, in fact. And you could also go to the festivals of another city and travel. People traveled a lot on pilgrimages to different. There were also some festivals where also like the Olympic Games. Every festival, every social activity was basically connected to the gods. The gods were invited. In fact, you would not have a meal with meat without inviting the gods, because meat would have always to be sacrificed, more or less. Of course, some people would, maybe not chicken and so on, but basically most occasions where people ate meat was, a religious occasion. So that was the ritual. But all this ritual life did not involve any special belief. It was not a question whether you believe this God exists or not. I mean, of course he exists because he has a house, he has a temple, and, but that was not there was no special doctrine connected to that at all. You didn't have to be asked, what do you believe? It was just participating it was assumed that the gods exist, but many people would say, well, I'm not sure, but anyway, they would go to, so that part of religion was basically a part of social life, political life even. And then you had the stories, the myth, about the gods. There were all kinds of myths about the gods. They were not. They were, of course, connected, but basically these were also just stories that people told. They told them in verse. It was poetry. Most of it was poetry. So it was made for poetry, for theater. This was the subject of tragedies, and so this was entertainment. And again, did people believe in it or not? Well, it depends. Children surely believed in it, like they believe in Santa Claus. Maybe, you cannot make a systematic rule because there was no doctrine. It was just a story, and there were different versions of the same story. So there was not one standard story that everybody has to believe. You could rewrite it all as you wanted. But that was part of the religious life because those stories were about the gods and about the heroes and so on. And then finally you have philosophy. And that was in fact the higher religion because as I said, theology was part of philosophy, the science of God. Who are the gods? What are the gods? And philosophers sometimes. So there was a tension between the philosophers and the ritual. Philosophers sometimes looked down on the rituals, and they didn't like so much to the idea to represent the gods as statues. And there was a lot of criticism from the philosophers against popular religion. But on the other hand, they also recognized, if you look at Cicero, for example, you read Cicero, he was very much into philosophy, but he also recognized the value of popular religion and civic religion as a part of the civic spirit. So, so it's very difficult to define the Roman religion because when we think religion today, we think Christianity and we think a religion of salvation, a religion to save my soul. So that also existed in the Roman world, but in philosophy, if you wanted to save your soul, you become a philosopher. There were also different mystery cults. There were also other things that had to do with, trying to connect to the higher realm, the mystery cult, the cults of Isis, and so on. So these were also a little bit different things. So it's a vast world, but it's a mistake, and that's an important point, because most people used to think there are two assumptions that I discovered. I thought they were true originally, and I studied, I realized they're false. One of the assumptions is that the Christianization was a natural process because paganism was dying. So the Romans needed something new. They needed something. They were fed up with their God. That's not true at all. Historians of today say not at all. It was it was moving. The Roman Empire was like every society, evolving. Some things were changing. Some things were coming out of fashion, and some new religion were appearing. But it was Roman people were extremely religious, and there was nothing that was dying there. There was tension. There were controversies, conflicts, and so on. And so it did not happen. It was a religious war. The Christianization fundamentally was a religious war of 2 centuries, lasted 2 centuries basically. Very bloody, very based on terror, based on persecution, based on civil war. There were civil wars also that weakened the Roman Empire to the point that it's possible to argue that the civil wars between Christians and pagans were the main reason of the fall of the Roman Empire. It considerably weakened the military capacity of Rome. So it was a very, very bloody process. But Christians have written, as always, the history is written by the victors, and the victors are the Christian. In fact, one of the reasons that late antiquity was not very much studied is that we have very few pagan sources. The history of that period has been told to us by Christian authors. And they told us that paganism was satanic and anyway dying, and everybody was so happy to become Christian. They gave us, but historians today who can also, the purpose of historians to also revise the standard history, they realize if you look at it from the pagan side, it was a very bloody civil war, a religious war.
Speaking of religious wars, walk me through the Jewish wars against Rome.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, that's an interesting, that's an interesting aspect which connects to that, because it's interesting to know that the Romans had a very big problem with the Jewish nation, and even before the Romans, and even before the Romans, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt and the Seleucid, the heirs of Alexander the Great, always had difficulty with the Jewish nation, and the Romans, when General Pompey conquered Palestine, which was not really called Palestine yet, but anyway, he finally waged a war against Jerusalem. He conquered Jerusalem. He brought a lot of Jewish captives to Rome. That's how many Jews came to Rome in the beginning. And then again, in the 60s, we have the Jewish wars. We know of them based on the chronicles or the histories of Flavius Josephus. And that led to the destruction of the Jewish temple, which had been built by Herod the Great. So Herod the Great was actually the king that the Romans had put in charge. He was not a full-blooded Jew, but he was a Romanized half-Jew. And he built, he rebuilt Jerusalem. He built new cities like Caesarea. And there was always in the history of Israel, the history of Israel is always characterized by internal struggle between Jews who want to assimilate to the Hellenistic culture. They love Greek, they learn Greek, they want to be part of this Greek culture, and a core of nationalists who want to stick to the Torah and preserve the Jewish nation, preserve the rituals of circumcision, 8-day circumcision, and the ban, forbid the Jews to intermarry and so on. So the Jewish wars was part of started as a civil war between the Hellenistic Jews and the anti-Hellenistic Jews. And that led to the destruction of the Jewish temple. But that was not the end of it, because there were still, in the early 2nd century, new revolt of the Jews in Alexandria, in North Africa, because actually, I think more than 2/3 of the Jews lived outside of Israel, in the big cities like Alexandria, Carthage, and so on. So they rebelled, in the 2nd century. And then I think the most important period to focus on, I think the best illustration of the problem is to focus on the time of Emperor Adrian, I think, in 130 and something. Okay, Adrian was determined basically to get rid of the Jews as a nation. So he was not determined to exterminate the Jews, but he was determined to force them to assimilate completely. So he forbade, and he was not the first to do that, but he forbade circumcision. He understood that 8-day circumcision is the key, or even the lock of Jewishness. If Jews are not allowed to do that, for Romans Romans were very tolerant about religion, but one thing they never tolerated was human sacrifices and ritual mutilation. So it was not only against the Jews; they just felt this is really evil. So he forbade circumcision. He destroyed Jerusalem. He built a new city on just nearby. He called it by his own name, and he rebaptized Israel as Palestine. It was actually Adrian who gave this name, Palestine. Sometimes the Jews say, no, it's not Palestine, it's Roman call it Palestine. They're right, actually. It's Adrian who gave the name Palestine in memory of a Greek people called the Philistine, who were Greek people who lived there for some time. So he was really, that shows how upset, how fed up the Romans were with the Jews, for 2 centuries, let's say, from the very beginning, from the 1st century BC to the late 2nd century AD, that actually 3 centuries, Romans were constantly struggling with this nation, which had an inherent incapacity to assimilate because of their religious tradition, because their God forbade them to assimilate, because their God taught them that all other gods are demons. And that was, Romans understood very well that we are tolerant people. All gods are okay. We don't, everybody can worship the gods they want. If you live in one city, you worship your city gods, but you can also worship any other god you want. You may like some god, but, the God of the Jews. And that's why the Jews were called atheists, actually, because they rejected the gods. They refused to, even if they go to a city, they refused to, to make the basic offerings to the gods of the cities. And of course, but because they were powerful, they had sometimes some privileges. But that shows that that's an important point, because if we compare the situation, if we compare how the Romans saw the Jews before Christianity, first of all, they never took seriously, the Jews' idea that they were chosen by God. I mean, you cannot find even one Roman intellectual. Of course, some people would maybe join the Jews and believe them, but you cannot find even one philosopher, intellectual who took that seriously. No Roman, no Greek ever believed it makes sense that the God, the creator of the universe, chose one people among others, and if he so that from that point of view, the situation of the Jews changed completely, because basically Christianity accepts that claim that God chose the Jews. Even though Christian would say, well, yes, but, then you messed up, so he unchose you. But, there's something radically pro-Jewish in Christianity if we compare it to the Roman civilization.
You've described the emergence of Christianity from Judaism as something that lends credence, I think you said, to the suspicion that it was effectively created as a virus targeted at the Romans.
Well, there is a theory. I mean, Nietzsche, for example, almost said that, but I don't think he considered it was a trick, an invention of the Jews to conquer Rome. But he would say, well, the result is that the Jews conquered Rome. Yahweh conquered Rome. The Jews conquered Rome through Christianity. So then, and that's true in many ways. If you look at the influence of Christianity, I came to the point that if you really study what happened, you can see that Christianity really Judaized our civilization. But now, was it a conspiracy? I don't believe it. That's why I took the approach of Kevin MacDonald. It was a group evolutionary strategy, which doesn't mean it was which might mean it was a calculated strategy. But that's still ambivalent. If we look at Paul, because Paul is basically the inventor of Gentile Christianity, if we look at the Jews the Jewish Christian in Jerusalem, that's another question, because it was just a Jewish sect. They had no intention to convert the Romans. But Paul came out and said, well, yes, let's convert the Romans with that. So if you look at him, it's a little bit difficult, but to conclude, he might be completely lying. He might have had this idea, well, that's the great religion. With that, we're going to conquer Rome and then finally lead Rome to rebuild the temple, which is happening now. It took 2,000 years, but that's exactly what's happening now. But there's no evidence that Paul was, involved in this kind of deception. It's more, in my view, it's more that we have to understand that Jews, like Paul, had a very deep sense that the Jews are the superior people who are destined to save the world. You know, Jews always want to save the Gentiles from their own narrow-mindedness, from their own, that's the fundamental impulse of the Jews in the nations. They are everywhere, and everywhere they feel they are superior, so they have to teach the rest of the world, what they know. And so they have to save the world. So Paul was like this, he wants to save the Roman world as a Jew. And if you read Romans, his epistle to the Romans, chapter 11, he say, well, because the Jews rejected Jesus, then it doesn't matter, we're going to convert the whole Roman Empire, and at the end, it will all come back to the Jews. So in the end, the prophecies will be true. The prophecies that the Jewish people will rule over the world will be true. So he had this idea that, well, we're going to go, this long road, but it will always come down to the same, to the accomplishment of the prophecies in the Jewish Tanakh, which say that the Jewish people will rule the world. So, it's difficult to understand, the way of his mental, the way his mind is traveling in this way, and the whole logic. But it's not also maybe not so complicated. So I don't believe Christianity was a Jewish conspiracy, but I believe it was after everything the Jews went through, after the destruction of their temple in 70, and after the wars of Adrian against Jerusalem again. Because actually before 130 we don't know anything about Christianity, so it really started under Paul maybe, but it really became Christians suddenly appeared on the historical scene in the second part of the 2nd century. Before that we almost know nothing. So we can imagine a lot of Jews in the world understood that nationalism failed, the messianic Judaism failed, so let's find another way, because our destiny is anyway to convert the Roman Empire. So they used all the Jewish Hellenistic thinking of people like Philo of Alexandria. There had been already a lot of Hellenistic Jews who had, made bridges between Judaism and Hellenistic culture. So they used that. They used Philo of Alexandria a lot, especially his theory of the Logos. That's how they declare, let's say Jesus is the Logos. That's the bridge. The Logos is a philosophical concept coming from Stoicism, and Philo of Alexandria had already built the bridge. So Christianity used that bridge and declared Jesus is the Logos. Okay, and if Jesus is the Logos, then we can talk to the Romans about the Logos, and we can. So they build different kind of bridges like this to convert the Romans to Christianity. But fundamentally, Christianity, in the very, very early, the fundamental doctrine of Christianity, if you read Paul, the fundamental doctrine of Christianity in Paul is 100% Jewish, because it's based on the idea that that God created man immortal, and then man committed the original sin. Whether you call it original sin, it doesn't matter. Then death came into the world, and then in the Jewish scripture, then you have this idea that there is some resurrection at the end of days somehow, So Christianity said, they adopted that kind of paradigm, and they say Jesus is resurrected from the dead, so he's the first resurrected from the dead. So this is the time of the resurrection now. Jesus is the first one who we're all going to follow. And so the end of days are coming soon, and even though Christ will come back and pick up everybody and resurrect the dead, and those who are not dead will be uplifted. That's directly coming from the Torah, from the Genesis story, Genesis chapter 3. It's but they mixed that with the Logos Christology. They mixed that also. They introduced life after death, the immortal soul, and so on. There was a kind of mixture.
You were making the point earlier that the West is fundamentally not rooted in Christianity, and then you also, in your work, have made the point that Christianity didn't win. It eventually won Europe, but it didn't win Europe on its merits. It won Europe through state terrorism. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that historically, if you study the period of the Christianization, what happened? Basically, Constantine the Great declared, after he went through 2 civil wars, he defeated 2 competitors until he became the ruler of the whole empire, East and West. Before that, there had been different emperors for the East and West, and he united the whole thing, and he declared himself a Christian, and he promoted, sponsored, financed Christianity tremendously, built churches, and he decided to build a new capital city, Constantinople, which in his mind became a Christian city. In fact, he was very much disliked in Rome. When he defeated Maxentius, for example, Maxentius was very much loved in Rome. He was a Roman, a real Roman. And so Constantine did not like Rome, the city of Rome. He didn't feel welcome there. Also because he refused, when he went there only 2 times. He refused to go and, worship to go to the temple and pay tribute to the gods and so on, as a Christian. So there was a lot of tension with the Romans. The Roman aristocracy resisted the longest against the Christianization, until the end of the 4th century, even longer. So he built his capital, which was a Christian. There were no temples in Constantinople. There were statues because he looted the statues from pagan temples. So he persecuted paganism and he sponsored Christianity, but he did not forbid people to go to the temple. He just declared no more, because the temples were financed by the states, by the cities, so no more money. So of course, but then his son increased the pressure against paganism, forbade the sacrifices, animal sacrifice, and every celebration was an animal sacrifice. But the Christians say, "Oh, that's terrible, animal sacrifice." I don't see why it's terrible, because we kill animals. They were killed. It was part of a ritual, so people saw it. So there were a lot of blood, and it was in the understanding. Christians say, "Well, it's wrong to offer animals to the gods." In fact, the animals were not really offered to the gods. It's more the gods were invited to the banquet. It's more like the gods were part, because when you kill an animal, you don't do it's something special. You have to. It was not like the gods need blood. It was not the understanding of the Romans that the gods need blood. It was not like this. It's just like eating meat is something that requires some kind of religious celebration. So anyway, the sacrifices were forbidden. Then little by little, going to the temples was forbidden. Then there were persecutions. Some priests were killed. You would go to prison. There were a very intense persecution. We think that the Christians were persecuted by the pagans before Constantine, but in fact, if we compare, the persecution of pagans by the Christian was 10 times more severe. And then there were civil wars, because in fact it didn't go so easily. So there were a series of civil wars where, especially in the West, the Western people of the Roman Empire, including the Romans from Rome, chose a pagan emperor. And that actually started with Maxentius. Maxentius was, but at that time Constantine was not, he had not declared himself Christian, but that was already some kind of religious war between Constantine and Maxentius. Maxentius was defeated. So Constantine came out victorious. But then there were other there were a lot of civil wars during this whole period between Constantine but most of the time, and there are too many to even count, civil wars. That means generally wars between one emperor and another. And of course the loser is called the usurper, because he lost, but if he had won, then the other one would have been called the usurper. And in most cases, it was a war between a Christian and a pagan, or at least between a Christian fanatic emperor and an emperor who wanted at least to keep religious freedom and to allow people to continue. So these civil wars, from the point of view of several historians, were the major cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. We could discuss when and if it really fell, but and one of the reasons is that actually during those civil wars, even the barbarians were hired as mercenaries by one side or the other. So in fact, those civil wars kind of already started the barbarian invasions. All those barbarians, before they became invaders, they had been mercenaries used by some emperors against another. The Goths, especially the Goths of Alaric, were used in the battle which is considered the decisive battle between the Christians and the pagans. It was the Battle of the Frigidus. It's a river, I think, in Italy. And the Goths, who actually were Christian, not exactly the same kind of Christian as, but they were Christian. And so they fought on the side of, they were hired by Theodosius, the Christian emperor, to defeat the pagans. So that's how Alaric started. And then later Alaric sacked the city of Rome because he felt resentful for having not been rewarded enough for his contribution to defeat the pagans. So the paradox is that Alaric was a Christian who sacked the city of Rome, which was still actually very much a pagan city. So, the funny thing is that we imagine Alaric as a barbarian destroying the city of Rome, but in fact, Alaric was a Christian who destroyed a pagan city. So you see, that's just an example that shows that if we study that period with a little bit of a revisionist attitude, we come up with a very different picture, and we come with the understanding that all those civil wars were part of a religious war. Not all of them, of course, had a religious motivation, but many of them had a religious motivation.
I'm only halfway through what I wanted to chat to you about, so I think let's call this part one, and we'll continue this. And in the meantime, could you tell me how I can follow your work?
Well, all these articles I'm writing at this moment are on my Substack. It's called Radbod's Lament. Radbod's Lament. I called it Radbod's Lament because Radbod is just a short story. He is a king of the Frisians in North Europe, who was so at the time of Charlemagne. He was about to be converted. He had been defeated by Charlemagne, and he accepted to be baptized, and then he went to be baptized, and then it's a story told in the life of the bishop who baptized, who wanted to baptize him. And so Radbod came and put one foot in a baptismal pool, whatever you call it, and then he had second thought, and he asked, well, if I get baptized and after I die, should I go and meet my ancestors? And then the bishop said, no, it's out of the question, because your ancestors are in hell and you're going to go to heaven. Then he took his foot out and he said, well, I prefer to go with my ancestors, even in hell, I don't care. And so Radbod's Lament is I like this story because it's a story that illustrate what's fundamental difference between traditional pre-Christian religion, which was very much centered on, ancestor veneration, and Christianity. So all these articles are there, and I hope to make a book out of them soon, in a few months maybe.
Laurent Guyénot, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you, Jerm.